Welcome to the Baby Let's Talk podcast. My name is Ragna and I am your host. I am a medical doctor, a certified pre-postnatal trainer and a mother of 4, and I help moms reclaim their health and reach their goals through the power of movement, nutrition and overall healthy lifestyle. This podcast is born from my dedication to uncovering the truths about nutrition, exercise and lifestyle that genuinely benefit our bodies. We'll explore how to establish a lasting, healthy lifestyle that fits the reality of motherhood, how to enjoy an active, pain-free pregnancy, and how to navigate postpartum recovery to regain your fitness in a wholesome way. Join me as we debunk myths and discover the paths to excess energy, body confidence, and loving the life you live as a mom. Hi, and welcome to episode 6 of the Baby Let's Talk podcast. In today's episode, we will talk in more depth about the differences between the different types of fatty acids. And the reason we'll do that is because when we understand how the different types of fatty acids affect our body, it kind of becomes very clear to understand what types of foods we should be eating and what we should limit. And we have talked about this in some detail here and there in the previous episodes, but we will now put all our focus on this topic to understand this fully. So, fatty acids are molecules that consist of long chains of carbon and hydrogen atoms, making them hydrocarbons or hydrocarbon chains. And they have a carboxyl group at one end, which is responsible for their acidic properties. And this structure allows them to participate in various biological processes, including the formation of cell membranes and energy production. Now, the majority of fatty acids have an even number of carbons, and the different types of fatty acids are categorized based on how saturated the carbon atoms in these chains are with hydrogen atoms. So, in the chains of saturated fatty acids, the carbon atoms are fully saturated with hydrogen atoms, meaning that there are no double bonds between the carbon atoms in their chain, in their hydrocarbon chain. Then we have monounsaturated fatty acids, which contain one double bond. Mono means one. So one double bond in their molecular structure, and since there is one double bond between two of the carbon atoms in the chain, that means that two carbon atoms that are connected to are connected to one hydrogen atoms instead of two, and then they're connected to each other by the double bond. And chemically, this provides a weak spot, you could say, in their structure. So by breaking up the double bond, that creates two available spaces in the hydrocarbon chain for other atoms to come in and connect to the hydrocarbon chain. Now lastly, we have polyunsaturated fatty acids. And remember, poly means many, so these fatty acids have more than one double bonds in their chemical structure. So there are more carbon atoms that are not fully saturated with hydrogen atoms. Now, in general, the more double bonds there are in a fatty acid, the more unstable that fatty acid is. So polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, like they're often called, and like we will call them throughout this podcast as well, PUFAs are chemically more unstable than saturated fatty acids due to the presence of the multiple double bonds between carbon atoms in their hydrocarbon chain, because each double bond introduces a point of weakness where the fatty acid is more susceptible to chemical reactions such as oxidation. And what significance does that have? Well, for example, because saturated fatty acids don't have any double bonds in their hydrocarbon chains, and their carbon atoms are fully saturated with hydrogen atoms, so they are quite tightly packaged, making them relatively stable. It's a relatively stable molecule. So saturated fatty acids are well suited to be integrated into, for example, cell membranes, because they offer a stable structure for the membrane. But polyunsaturated fatty acids, however, they have two or more double bonds in their structure, and that creates kinks or bends in the structure of the fatty acid chain, so they are not packaged as tightly. So when polyunsaturated fatty acids are integrated into the lipid bilayer of cell membranes, the structure of the lipid bilayer is then not as well structured. That is, it becomes more fluid and also more susceptible to damage. And as I've mentioned a few times now, polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, are particularly prone to oxidation because of their double bonds. And in the realm of chemistry, oxidation refers to a reaction where electrons are lost from a molecule, often involving oxygen, but not exclusively so. Now, this process can affect various substances, including PUFAs, where the presence of multiple double bonds makes them particularly susceptible to this. So when PUFAs encounter oxygen, for example, the oxygen can break these double bonds and attach itself to the fatty acid chain. And this interaction can change the structure and function of the fatty acid and is a normal part of cellular metabolism that can, however, lead to the production of free radicals. And these free radicals are unstable molecules that can initiate a chain reaction of damage, which is known as oxidative stress, and can potentially compromise cell integrity and contribute to disease. And then we have something that's called lipid peroxidation, which is a specific, more destructive type of oxidation that occurs primarily in lipids that are containing carbon-carbon double bonds, like PUFAs. Now, this process, lipid peroxidation, is initiated by the attack of free radicals and causes a chain reaction that can severely damage our cell membranes, because lipid peroxidation leads to the formation of various harmful byproducts, including one that's called, and prepare yourself, malondialdehyde, and another that's called 4-hydroxynonenal. You don't have to remember these names. But these compounds can further react with and damage vital cellular components such as DNA and proteins, exacerbating cellular dysfunction and death. That is, weakening and destroying our cells even further. So this chain reaction continues until it's stopped by antioxidants, which protect cells by neutralizing free radicals. And this process is well known to be involved in various diseases like atherosclerosis and neurodegeneration, for example. So the exposure of PUFAs to environmental factors like heat, light, or oxygen accelerates both oxidation and lipid peroxidation. And during lipid peroxidation, the integrity of fatty acids is severely compromised, affecting not only the fatty acids themselves, but also the broader cellular environment when they are incorporated into our cell membranes, for example. So this process is a significant concern in various pathological states where it contributes to ongoing tissue damage, but also in the spoilage of foods that contain PUFAs, and also in regards to safety when PUFAs are used in, for example, cooking oils. Now, because of this, PUFAs, or polyunsaturated fatty acids, aren't as stable as saturated fatty acids, and they need to be stored and handled with care, especially when they're used in food products and industrial settings. And like I mentioned earlier, because of these differences in the chemical structure of these fatty acids, this determines the form of these fats at different temperatures. So, as saturated fatty acids, they have no double bonds. This makes them highly stable at room temperature, where they generally remain solid, like animal fat. Now, monounsaturated fatty acids, they have one double bond and they are liquid at room temperature but solid when they are cooled. For example, when we put them in the refrigerator, like olive oil. You've maybe noticed that if you've put it in the refrigerator, then it becomes cloudy and thick. And then we have polyunsaturated fatty acids. They, however, are more fluid than saturated fats, so they are liquid at room temperature and remain so even when they are chilled. So in terms of polyunsaturated fatty acids in our food, these fatty acids are more prone to oxidation because of the many double bonds in their structure, and this can lead to rancidity when PUFA-rich oils are exposed to heat, light, or oxygen. That is, the double bonds in the hydrocarbon chains of PUFAs make them vulnerable, as these double bonds are points of vulnerability where oxidation can easily occur when it's exposed to, for example, heat, light, or oxygen. So just on a side note, vegetable oils, which are high in PUFAs, they should never be stored in a clear container. And also they should not be used in cooking. They should not be heated. So when PUFAs in oils, such as fish oil, for example, become oxidized, they often become rancid, which not only spoils the flavor and the odor of the oils containing PUFAs, but that can also diminish their nutritional value and also safety. They become unsafe. So in practical terms, this means that oils that are rich in PUFAs, like fish oil, flaxseed oil, soybean oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, canola oil, or rapeseed oil, these oils should be stored in a dark, airtight container to minimize exposure to oxygen and also to light, and should actually not be used in cooking because of their sensitivity to heat. But just keep this in mind the next time you go to the store and look at all these vegetable oils, which are mostly stored in clear plastic bottles, and often advised to use as cooking oils. Okay, so because saturated fatty acids do not have double bonds in their hydrocarbon chains, they are less prone to oxidation. They are more stable and are therefore often used and much more suitable to use in, for example, cooking. Now, we all know that throughout the last few decades, saturated fatty acids have generally been linked to the development of heart disease, while more unsaturated fatty acids have been labeled as heart healthy. And this dichotomy traces back to the mid-20th century, when rising cardiovascular disease rates prompted a man named Ancel Keys to propose a hypothesis that he called diet heart hypothesis, which linked saturated fat consumption with increased heart disease risk. Now, in short, this hypothesis influenced decades of dietary guidelines and public perceptions, despite criticisms and methodological flaws that have been highlighted in many other studies that have been done since. So for the past 70 years or so, saturated fats have been demonized as the main culprit for heart disease risk, while mono and polyunsaturated fats have been labeled as heart healthy. Now, I have to dive a little bit deep into this right here with you, so that you understand why it developed like this. That is why we have been told that saturated fatty acids are not healthy. And all of this took me a long while to accept, actually. So in the 1950s, when cardiovascular disease rates in the United States and other developed countries were rising dramatically, Ancel Keys, who was an American physiologist, he proposed the diet heart hypothesis, which suggested a link between the consumption of saturated fats, serum cholesterol levels, and the risk of heart disease. That is, he suggested that there was a link between the consumption of saturated fats, that leads to higher cholesterol, and higher cholesterol leads to the development of heart disease. And this hypothesis was based on observational data, including Keys' own 7-country study, which showed a correlation between diets high in saturated fats and an increased rate of heart disease. Correlation, just to note here, is not the same as causation, and we will get into that. So, that is, first, he did a plot from 22 countries as a part of a preliminary analysis for a presentation that he made at the World Health Organization in 1953. And in this analysis, he plotted data from 22 countries showing the relationship between dietary fat intake, particularly saturated fat, and death rates from coronary heart disease. And the data suggested a correlation where countries with higher intake of saturated fats had higher rates of coronary heart disease mortality. And this correlation became the foundational observation that made him conduct the 7-country study. So he then chose 7 countries to do, out of these 22 countries, to do a further study. So this plot that he did in the beginning, that sparked an idea that higher fat consumption in the form of saturated fat could be a risk factor for cardiovascular disease or coronary heart disease. But this initial analysis was highly criticized because of, firstly, selection bias. That is, Keyes is said to have selectively included data that supported his hypothesis while ignoring countries that did not fit the expected patterns, such as France and Germany, which had high fat consumption but lower rates of heart disease. And also his analysis only showed a correlation between fat intake and coronary heart disease and could not establish causation because it was not controlled for many other factors that could well have influenced the outcome, like, for example, exercise, smoking rates, and other dietary components. So then he went ahead and did this 7-country study with 7 out of the 22 countries that he had formerly looked into, with the intention of addressing some of the limitations of the earlier analysis. But this study has also been shown to be extremely flawed. Again, because of selection bias, as he is said to have excluded countries where people consume high amounts of saturated fats, but had low rates of coronary heart disease, such as France and also Switzerland. And this has later become known as the French paradox. Now, secondly, the 7-country study has also been criticized for its reliance on correlational data, which does not prove causation. That is, we can find correlations between a lot of things, but that does not necessarily mean that one thing causes the other. For example, there is a correlation between more ice cream sales and shark attacks, but that does not mean that eating ice cream causes shark attacks. This correlation is simply because both of these things happen more often during the summertime, because that's when people are more likely to be swimming in the ocean and be eating ice cream. Or another example is if we would do a study and find that there is a correlation between women of higher socioeconomic status and more exercise, which is the case. Research consistently shows that. So there is a correlation there, that women of higher socioeconomic statuses, they exercise more, but higher socioeconomic status does not cause women to exercise more. It's not the cause of more exercise. You get it, right? So in the 7 countries study, the correlations that were observed between saturated fat intake and heart disease rates did not account for other dietary and lifestyle factors that could influence heart disease, such as the intake of refined sugar and refined carbohydrates, smoking habits, physical activity levels, genetic factors, etc. And this is really important because, for example, people who tend to eat a lot of saturated fats, they often don't follow dietary guidelines. They often also eat a lot of processed foods, they smoke, they drink, they don't exercise, and so forth. So there are a lot of things that can affect this here. And another criticism towards this study is the oversimplification of the link between diet and heart disease, because it focused only on a single nutrient, saturated fat, as the primary cause of coronary heart disease, which is potentially oversimplifying the complex interactions between various dietary components and other risk factors. Now, there were also huge methodological issues with the study, such as the accuracy of dietary data collection, which was based on food frequency questionnaires and 24-hour recalls. That is, food frequency questionnaires, these are questionnaires that collect data on how often a person consumes certain foods over a specific time period, maybe a month or a year. So it presents a list of foods and beverages with options to indicate the frequency of consumption. That is, you're supposed to estimate how often you eat a specific type of food. For example, how often you drink milk weekly or monthly, and how often you eat strawberries weekly or monthly or yearly. And the limitation here is that these questionnaires depend on the respondent's memory and also understanding of the portion size. And they also they can also be influenced by the respondents' desire to report a diet that they think is socially desirable rather than what they maybe actually consume. Now, 24-hour recalls, that involves a detailed interview where participants are asked to recall all the foods and beverages they consumed in the previous 24 hours or the preceding day. And they're supposed to do so in detail, and this also relies on the participant's memory, which can lead to either underreporting or overreporting, just like the food frequency questionnaires. So these are the methods that were used to collect the data. Now, also regarding the methodological issues of the 7-country study is that the handling of and the analysis of the data were not up to standards, especially with respect to controlling for various confounding variables. Now, lastly, no other studies that have been done after the 7-country study have found the same strong results as the 7-country study. And most studies have found that the overall quality of the diet is much more important than the amount of a single nutrient of saturated fat alone. So the 7-country study simply aimed to solidify Keyes's diet heart hypothesis, at least it looks that way. And it gained a lot of traction in the 1960s and 1970s, and by then saturated fats were widely vilified and the public was advised to reduce their intake of saturated fats that is found in, for example, butter, meat and dairy products, and replace them with unsaturated fats, particularly polyunsaturated fats from vegetable oils. Now, after Keyes's observations and the 7-country study, researchers began testing the hypothesis by replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats, but they found very little support for the expected benefits on heart disease prevention. So these dietary changes did lower cholesterol levels. They have been shown to do so, but they did not translate into reduced cardiovascular mortality, which in and of itself suggests that there is a disconnect between cholesterol management and heart disease outcomes. And I'm not going to dive into that rabbit hole right now. Now, in the last 10 to 15 years, a lot of work has been done to re-evaluate the claims on saturated fats, and comprehensive reviews and analysis that have been done recently really challenge the demonization on saturated fats. For example, the Pure Studies findings and other recent review articles, which I will refer to in the show notes if you want to take a look at them, that contradict the diet heart hypothesis and actually show no significant link between saturated fat intake and heart disease risk. And some are even associating it with lower stroke risk. So the debate over saturated and unsaturated fats has had huge, profound implications for public health recommendations, the food industry, and consumer behavior. Because for decades, consumers were encouraged to choose low-fat and fat-free products and to reduce their saturated fat intake, leading to a proliferation of processed foods that have been marketed as healthy because they were low in saturated fats. And this shift also coincided with an increase in the consumption of refined carbohydrates and sugars at the time. As manufacturers, they replaced fats with sugar and other additives to improve the taste of low-fat products. Now, also, and this is really important and probably the single most impactful thing that has happened to the diet of humans in the human history, this shift from saturated fats promoted an opportunity to replace saturated fats in foods with other types of fats, that is, with unsaturated fats from industrially produced vegetable oils or seed oils. So, as all dietary recommendations following the 7-country study in the 1960s and 70s and 80s were recommending against saturated fats, then the food industry saw the opportunity to replace these natural animal-derived fats that humans have been consuming since forever with industrially produced cheap oils that were essentially originally produced as a machine lubricant. So, the use of vegetable oils or seed oils, which are very high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, has made food production much cheaper and much more effective. And these are oils such as safflower oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, soybean oil, cottonseed oil, canola oil, or rapeseed oil, etc. So seed oils, they were first used in the second half of the 19th century as a machine lubricant. And then it was introduced to the human diet with the American shortening brand Crisco. Now, Crisco was introduced in 1911 by Procter & Gamble, and it was the first shortening to be made entirely of vegetable oil, and it was originally cottonseed oil. So the initial intent when Crisco was made was to harden oils for use as raw material for soap. But the fact that the hydrogenation of the oils made the fat remain solid at normal storage temperatures, at room temperature, that made people think that this could find use in the food industry as a cheaper alternative to other fats, to animal fats. So Procter & Gamble used a very clever advertising techniques that encouraged consumers not to be concerned about ingredients, but to trust in a reliable brand. And then they had even more success when they used a marketing technique of giving out free cookbooks where every recipe called for Crisco. And then later in 1960, Crisco vegetable oil was introduced. And today additional products marketed under the Crisco brand include a cooking spray, various olive oils, and other cooking oils, including canola oil, corn oil, peanut oil, sunflower oil, and some blended oils, which is a mix of all of these. So there was a mix of things happening at the same time. The demonization of saturated fats in favor of the cheaper alternative with a better shelf life, seed oils, and also an increase in the use of processed sugar and other additives in food production, all of which contributed to a cheaper and more effective production of food that did not go as bad as easily. It tasted insanely good, and it made people craving more and more of these foods. And this has been a gold mine for the food industry, but there were early warning signs of the coronary heart disease risk of sugar or sucrose that emerged in the 1950s. And this was, of course, not good for the food industry, which was, in the end, then kind of saved by studies like, for example, the 7-country study that reported that it was saturated fats that was the culprit and not sugar or unsaturated fat or seed oils. And also, after the 7-country study was published, it presented a golden opportunity for the sugar industry to divert the attention from sugar and onto something else, in this case saturated fats. And it is well known today that the sugar industry actually paid researchers in the 1960s to implicate saturated fat and not sugar as a cause for heart disease. It has now been proven that the Sugar Research Foundation sponsored its first coronary heart disease research project in 1965, which is a literature review that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which singled out fat and cholesterol as the dietary cause of coronary heart disease. And it downplayed evidence that sucrose or sugar consumption was also a risk factor. The Sugar Research Foundation set the review's objective themselves. They contributed articles for inclusion in the review, and their funding and their role was not disclosed. So a lot of red flags here on this research. So to sum this up, the demonization of saturated fats, largely stemming from Keyes' diet heart hypothesis proposed in the mid-20th century, significantly influenced the dietary advice for the next decades, as this hypothesis suggested a direct link between saturated fat intake, increased serum cholesterol levels, and a higher risk of heart disease. And since meat, particularly red meat and processed meats, is a major source of saturated fats, meat and animal products in general became a primary target in the campaign to reduce cardiovascular risk. And as a result, health organizations and dietary guidelines all over began advising the public to limit their intake of meats that are high in saturated fats, so recommending reducing consumption of red meat, promoting lean meats, and replacing animal fats with vegetable oils or seed oils, rich in unsaturated fats, which we know are more unstable and more prone to processes such as oxidative stress, which harms the cells in our body. And this shift was intended to lower saturated fat intake, thereby supposedly reducing cholesterol levels and heart disease risk. However, the advice to limit meat consumption had unintended consequences. It contributed to an increased consumption of processed foods that were marketed as low fat, but were instead high in refined carbohydrates and sugars, and polyunsaturated fats. Now, this dietary shift away from natural sources of fats and proteins towards a higher intake of processed foods has been implicated in the rising rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome, conditions that also contribute to heart disease risk. Now, recent research now challenges this blanket vilification of saturated fats and, by extension, meat. And studies suggest that the context in which these fats are consumed, for example, as a part of whole nutrient-dense foods versus processed foods, that matters greatly. And furthermore, not all meat is equal, because processed meats, they have a stronger association with adverse health outcomes than unprocessed meats. And this nuanced understanding encourages a more balanced view of dietary fats and highlights the importance of overall dietary patterns over individual nutrients. That is, we cannot make assumptions that eating meat, for example, causes heart disease and other diseases just because we have found a correlation between saturated fat intake and disease risk. We must take into account the overall dietary and lifestyle context. That is, for example, people who often eat high amounts of saturated fats are often getting all of these saturated fats through processed food sources. They often smoke and drink, and they don't exercise, and so forth. So the overall context is much more important than focusing on one single nutrient. Now, with all of this being said, I have to introduce you to the research work of Dr. Chris Knobe, who is a fellow ophthalmologist who started researching diet and nutrition in relation to an eye disorder called age-related macular degeneration, or AMD, which is the leading cause of severe vision loss and blindness in the developed world. Now, he has written a book called The Ancestral Diet Revolution, which I highly recommend that you read. So, Dr. Knobe's epidemiology research is really interesting, and I've listed up a few things here that I'll share with you. So, in the late 19th century, chronic diseases were very rare. Obesity was exceptionally uncommon, and conditions like heart attacks, cancer, and diabetes were kind of unheard of. Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and age-related macular degeneration, the eye condition, were all unknown. But these conditions and diseases are very common and well known in today's society. So, if we go over some statistics here from America, only about 1% of people qualified as obese in the late 19th century, while today 42.7% of Americans are obese and another 31% is overweight. That's 74% of Americans being either overweight or obese. So 26% of Americans being normal weight or underweight. Okay. Now, regarding type 2 diabetes, 0.0028% of people had type 2 diabetes in the end of the 19th century. And in 1960, it was 0.91% of people that had type 2 diabetes. That is, it went from 0.0028% to 0.91%. And that's, like Dr. Knobe highlights, that's 325-fold increase in type 2 diabetes. And in 1991, this number was up to 2.97%. And then it was up to 6.95% in 2010. And then only 6 years later, in 2016, the prevalence was about 13%. And today, another 30% of Americans have prediabetes, which is a condition that precedes type 2 diabetes and can progress to full diabetes if one does not make important lifestyle changes. And like Dr. Kenobi points out in his lectures and in his book, this increase in type 2 diabetes since the late 19th century is a 4,643-fold increase in type 2 diabetes in 126 years, from 1890 to 2016. Now, regarding Alzheimer's disease and dementia, the first case of Alzheimer's was described in 1908, and then in 1948 there were 150 cases in the whole world. And then in 2023 we had 55 million cases. Regarding age-related macular degeneration, or AMD, the eye condition that kind of drove Dr. Kenobi to begin researching thoroughly in regards to nutrition, this condition is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 in the whole world. Now, regarding this eye condition, less than 50 cases had been reported in the whole world in an 80-year time period between 1851 and 1930. But in 2020, 196 million people had this condition. Now, regarding heart attacks, only 8 cases of heart attacks had been reported in the 19th century in the world. Then in 1912, the first case of coronary heart disease was reported, but then only about 20 years later, coronary heart disease had suddenly become the leading cause of death. And then in 2010, 1 out of every 3 people in the US died from coronary heart disease. And regarding cancer, in the 19th century, cancer was the cause of death for about 0.5% of people in America. And in 1900, this number was up to 5.9%. And in 2010, it was up to approximately 31%. But what has happened in the past 120, 140 years? How did this happen? How did this happen to the whole developed or westernized world at approximately the same time? So before we had so much of these chronic diseases, that was a time before the introduction of processed foods and vegetable oils. So post-American Civil War, the introduction of cottonseed oil marked the beginning of widespread use of vegetable oils, such as soybean oil and later Crisco, like we talked about by Procter & Gamble, which gradually replaced animal fats in the American diet. Now, cottonseed oil was hard to sell at first, since Americans only knew of it as a machine lubricant, machine oil or lamp oil. So at first, manufacturers mixed it with olive oil to try to introduce it to the diet, or with lard or with butter to create oleomargarine. And after that, soybean oil was introduced into the food supply in 1909. And then in 1911, the famous Crisco shortening was introduced, like we talked about earlier, which was a semi-solid chemical concoction derived from cottonseed oil. And this shortening would then begin to compete with the traditional cooking fats like lard, butter, and beef tallow. And then for the next decades, other Industrial Revolution opportunists began doing the same, producing oils of corn, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, etc. And as the consumption of these oils increased, so did the prevalence of chronic diseases, including coronary heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, AMD, etc. And all the while, the use of butter, beef tallow, and pork lard decreased significantly. So, by 1950, the vegetable oils were well on the way to almost completely replace animal fats for the added fats in the diet, and chronic diseases continued to increase. By 1961, coronary heart disease was reaching unprecedented levels, and evidence was emerging that vegetable oils reduced blood cholesterol. So at this time, Ansel Keys, whose work I talked about earlier, introduced the diet heart hypothesis with his 7 countries study, a theory which held that saturated fats caused an elevation in cholesterol, and cholesterol caused heart disease. Now, within just a few decades, Keys' study and diet heart hypothesis had the support of American Heart Association and then many of the most prestigious institutions in the US. But at the same time, all of the chronic diseases, including the biggest ones, coronary heart disease and cancer, which were just a few decades earlier extremely rare, were then increasing at an unprecedented rate. Now, after the diet heart hypothesis gained so much popularity, saturated fats were conveniently stamped as the culprit, as the bad guy. But many researchers have begun looking back on the evidence and find that saturated fat could never have caused this incredible increase in chronic diseases, as they have been consumed in large amounts in many diets throughout time, with these conditions and diseases being almost unknown. And saturated fat consumption is still found in populations where these diseases are almost not found. So, for example, in some traditional living tribes, such as the traditional living Maasai, who are all quite tall, lean, and they don't have any of these chronic diseases, their diet consists of raw, unpasteurized milk, the meat of cattle, sheep, and goats, and also fresh cow's blood. And strikingly, they consume almost no plant food at all. The average Maasai consumes about 3 to 5 liters of milk per day, when enough milk is available, and their average daily caloric intake has been estimated to be around 3,000 calories per day, with 66% of these calories derived from fat. And these fats are coming from animal products, from mostly milk and meat. And on average, their cholesterol intake is between 500 and 2,000 milligrams per person per day, which is similar to that of the average person in the US. But during the dry season, they drink a thicker mixture of milk and blood and occasionally have a very large amount of meat. And then their cholesterol and fat intake is much higher than that for the average person in the US. Yet still, they don't develop these chronic diseases and they don't get fat. They're in great shape and in great health. Now, another argument that doesn't quite add up to saturated fats being the culprit here is that in a 100-year time period from 1909 to 2009, the total fat intake for an average person increased a little bit, but the consumption of animal fats, that is saturated fats, decreased by more than half. But the intake of vegetable fats increased by about 4 times. And you can see this in a graph from Dr. Kanopi's book, and I'll show that to you here. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can see the graph here. So in 1909, the majority of the fat that people were consuming came from animal fats, and only a small portion came from vegetable fats. And we had very little chronic diseases, and a very small portion of the people were overweight or obese. But now, the total fat intake, it has increased a little bit, yes, but it's not due to an increase in the consumption of saturated fats. People today actually eat much less saturated fats than in the early 1900s, when the majority of today's chronic diseases were unheard of. So what has happened is that today the absolute majority of the fat in our diet is coming from vegetable oils or vegetable fats, and only a small fraction is coming from animal fats. And I could get into so much detail here, but we'll cover this topic again in later episodes in smaller chunks. Now, added sugar or refined sugar has also been suggested to be an important culprit in this development, the chronic disease development, and so have also refined carbs. But if we look at the data, consumption of added sugar increased slightly until about 1980-1990, where it has mostly plateaued or been on the decline since. And all the while, chronic diseases keep rising. Now, most researchers, they do agree that the increase in chronic diseases has been due to the introduction of processed foods. But what is it about the processed foods that makes it so dangerous? Which factor of the processed foods is the culprit? Is it simply because we're able to consume more calories when we eat processed foods? So it's the overconsumption of calories that's causing this? Or is it the added sugars or the refined carbohydrates? Or is it other additives like food coloring and so forth? Or is it maybe the fat that is used in these products? which is so different from what we have been used to consume evolutionary throughout time up until the Industrial Revolution? The vegetable oils? Could it be that? So if we look at sugar consumption, and here we're talking about added sugar in any form, whether it's table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, cane sugar, maple syrup, honey, fruit juices or vegetable juices, etc., then we can see in epidemiology studies from all around the world where processed foods are a part of the diet, that when we plot together sugar consumption and chronic diseases, sugar consumption increased around the mid-20th century and has then plateaued approximately by the 1980s and 1990s, but still chronic diseases keep going up. However, if we take a look at the consumption of vegetable oils, it has gone up from virtually no amounts of vegetable oils by the end of the 19th century, maybe very low amounts of olive oil, but that was very rare. And in 2010, an average person was consuming 80 grams of vegetable oils per day. 80 grams of oil equal 720 calories per day, which is 32% of the average US caloric intake per day. So taking into account several factors here, it's been calculated that for an average person, about 1/4 and up to 1/3 of the caloric intake is coming from vegetable oils. So just picture this in your head for me here. 1/4 to 1/3 of the total calories for an average person in today's society is coming from vegetable oils or seed oils. In 1900, when obesity rates were 1%, 99% of fat that was added to food came from animal fat. But in 2005, when obesity rates were 40.2% in the US, 86% of added fats to foods were from vegetable oils. And here is something that is extremely important to keep in mind. In the US dietary guidelines that came out in 1980, it was recommended to reduce fat in the diet. And in general, people did that. They restricted their total fat intake, but despite that, the amount of vegetable oils that people consumed per day kept increasing. So people were consuming less fat in their diet, but more and more vegetable oils. They were replacing the animal fats with vegetable oils. It was the animal fat that absolutely most people cut out or reduced in large amounts. So the absolute majority of the fat intake was coming through vegetable oils and not animal fat or saturated fat. Now, okay, what is it that is so bad about vegetable oils or seed oils? So seed oils are rich in the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid called linoleic acid. And now remember what we talked about regarding the chemistry of the different fatty acids in the beginning of this episode, that polyunsaturated fatty acids are more unstable and more prone to damage because they have multiple double bonds in their fatty acid chains. And these double bonds create weak spots in the fatty acid structure. But saturated fatty acids are more stable and less susceptible to damage because they don't have any double bonds in their fatty acid chains. They are fully saturated with hydrogen atoms. Okay, now in 1865, the daily omega-6 fatty acid consumption was about 2.4 grams per day. That is about 1.1% of daily caloric intake of people back then was coming from linoleic acid. And this number had then doubled in 1909 because of the introduction of cottonseed oil. So the daily consumption of omega-6 or linoleic acid was about 4.84 grams per day, which is about 2% of daily calories. So it had gone up from 1.1% of daily calories to 2% of daily calories. And then in 1999, when the consumption of animal fats were less than half of what it was in 1909, and the majority of fats in people's diets were coming from vegetable oils, omega-6 consumption was 18 grams per day, or 7% of daily caloric intake. And then in 2008, the amount of daily omega-6 consumption was up to 29 grams per day. That is 11.8 grams of daily caloric intake coming from linoleic acid. Now, vegetable oils contain everything from 20 to 78% omega-6, whereas in animal fat, omega-6 fatty acids are only 1 to 2.5% of the fat content. But what is it that makes this high amount of omega-6 in our diet so dangerous? It is because these fatty acids accumulate in our body and become pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic through advanced lipid oxidation end products, and they cause nutrient deficiency. And this is the perfect recipe for metabolic disease and physical degeneration. Now, when I first heard about this and I started reading up, I must admit that I was extremely skeptical. I had always been a true believer in our whole system, that if the majority of nutrition researchers and studies agreed, and almost all dietary guidelines were mainly the same all around the world, and all the dietary advice is praising nuts and seeds and legumes and grains and a lot of vegetables and some fruits, and limit the intake of red meat, rather go for lean meat like chicken and pork. And like in some countries where they're even specifying the recommended minimum amount of vegetable oils you should consume per day. For example, in the country I currently live in the newest recommendations here in Norway, where they are suggesting a minimum of 29 grams of vegetable oils per day. So depending on the omega-6 content of the vegetable oils you choose, this ranges from about 6 grams of omega-6 per day to 22 grams per day. So that's about 3 to 10% of daily calories coming from omega-6. And they're recommending that. So, it made it really hard for me to believe in statements and research results that I was hearing and reading about every now and then about vegetable oils and polyunsaturated fats, that they were maybe not good for you. I didn't believe all of this and kind of refused to listen to it for a very long time. So, to be honest, this took me a long time to fathom. But the more I read up on this, the more I dived into all of the research, because I wanted to kind of just prove that my belief was right, that polyunsaturated fats, such as from vegetable oils, really were heart healthy like they're labeled. The more research I did, the more I began to see that I couldn't find detailed explanations that I, let's say, wanted, because I started my journey to find out that I was right. I wanted to confirm that everything I had believed in regards to nutrition up until then was correct. And it's dangerous to look at research in that way, but the evidence was just so compelling that I couldn't stay with what I had believed. Because when I dived into really understanding the effect that nutrition has on our body on the most basic level, on a cellular level, all evidence pointed away from my beliefs. Because our body is made up of cells. All tissues in our body is made up of cells, and tissues form our organs and organ systems and our whole body. All organs are constructed of cells, and each cell must be in good shape and function properly to produce energy so that we can function and stay alive. So if our cells are not in optimal health, it will eventually lead to problems with the function of tissues and organs, and eventually our whole body. And when I finally dove into this, it became quite clear that consuming large amounts of these fats is detrimental to our body. It is not good for our body. The evidence is just so compelling that it's simply impossible to state otherwise. Believe me, I tried. So it wasn't until I fully understood the underlying mechanisms of how we are alive and what keeps us alive that I started seeing the whole picture. And that's why I will at times get very technical in this podcast to explain how our body functions on a cellular level, because by learning that in detail, by understanding how your body produces energy and keeps you alive and what it takes to do that, that's what will make you never question it again, what is good for your health and what is not. Because if your body cells operate smoothly and are in good health, then so will your whole body. But if your cells are struggling to produce energy and therefore they don't function properly, then some tissues may begin to struggle, leading to problems with some organs and/or organ systems. So you begin to develop some symptoms and get diagnosed with maybe some diseases and so on and so forth. So, okay, now back to the topic of this episode. So basically, the only thing in westernized diet that has the same rising pattern as the chronic disease incidence is the consumption of vegetable oils, or omega-6 consumption. That is, chronic diseases are going up, seed oil consumption is going up, sugar consumption has been increasing to a lesser degree before and has plateaued, so it's not going up anymore. Caloric intake has been increasing, but actually it has plateaued as well. And refined carbohydrates have also been increasing, but not to the same degree and have plateaued like sugar as well. And wherever vegetable oils are introduced into populations, a massive increase in these chronic diseases follows. That is, whenever we introduce vegetable oils into cultures that do not have it, then they start getting these chronic diseases that we have in the westernized world. And this has been shown over and over again in epidemiology studies. This includes increases in coronary heart disease, cancers, overweight and obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, age-related macular degeneration, autoimmune diseases, and many other chronic conditions. And this is what Dr. Chris Canobia has found in his research for the past decade. And he has held many talks about this, and he talks about this in his book, The Ancestral Diet Revolution. You can read this all there in great detail, everything that I've talked about now. Now, you may think to yourself that, yes, well, omega-6 is an essential fatty acid, that is, we do need to get it from our diet, but we actually do not need it in such high amounts. The daily amount of linoleic acid or omega-6 that you need is 0.5% of your daily calories coming from omega-6. That's the minimum you need. We don't need any more than that. And before the introduction of vegetable oils and processed foods, linoleic acid was about 1 to 2% of our diet. So we have always been getting adequate amounts of omega-6 or linoleic acid before. While today, linoleic acid stands for about 11% of our daily calories. Okay, we have now introduced the fact that vegetable oils in the amounts that we have in our diet today is detrimental to our health, and we've gone over a lot of data, and maybe you're totally convinced already, but if you're not, then we will dive deep into the why and the how. That is, why and how polyunsaturated fats have detrimental effects on our body. And just one thing I want to mention here is that my goal, I am not trying to convince you of anything or sell this to you or anything like that. I am simply providing you with some facts about how our body functions, how different substances and molecules affect our body's cells and how they function. And then it's up to you to make up your own mind regarding diet and your dietary standpoint. And there are actually a lot of politics revolving the different dietary standpoints and the food industry, and I do not want to get into all of that. My goal is not to get political and get involved in that. I just want to provide you with all the right tools you need in order to make informed choices for yourself. Okay. Now, I talked about it earlier that PUFAs accumulate in our body, and this has been shown in literature. The polyunsaturated fatty acids that we get in from our diet are incorporated into the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membranes across the various tissues in our body, and also into the mitochondrial membrane, and they affect the membrane's fluidity, functionality, and its overall biological process. So the more PUFAs that are in our diet, the more PUFAs are integrated into our cell membranes and the membranes of our mitochondria. And the more PUFAs that are integrated into our cell membranes, the more fluid these membranes become. They become leaky, and then because PUFAs are more prone to oxidation, Because of the double bonds in their structure, then more oxidative stress is going on in the cell, which, as we talked about in the beginning of this episode, is not good for the functionality and viability of our cells. Now remember, the mitochondria are the energy-producing factories of our cells, and the last step of the energy production process happens in the mitochondrial membrane. So this membrane has to be well structured and function well. And it is well known in the literature that the types of fats that we consume in the diet directly affect the fatty acid profile of the cell membranes in our body and the membranes of our mitochondria. And when dietary intake of PUFAs, or polyunsaturated fatty acids, increases, these fatty acids are incorporated into the cell membranes to a larger degree in place of saturated fatty acids or other less unsaturated fats. And this alteration can change the physical and chemical properties of the membranes. So when PUFAs are absorbed from the digestive system, they are transported by lipoproteins to various tissues and can then be incorporated into the membrane phospholipids in the cell membranes. Now, the percentage of PUFAs in human adipose tissue or fat tissue has increased significantly over the last century. In the early 1900s, the PUFA content in human adipose tissue or fat tissue was quite low, typically less than 5%. But by the 1950s, as dietary patterns began to include more industrially processed vegetable oils rich in PUFAs, this percentage began to rise. And today it is common to find PUFA levels around 15 to 30% in the fat tissue of individuals in Western countries. And it is well known in the literature that this increase reflects the changes in dietary habits that have happened in the past century and a half, particularly the increased consumption of vegetable oils, such as soybean, corn, and sunflower oils, which are high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. That is, when we look at our consumption of PUFAs, we are consuming much more PUFAs nowadays than before, but the biggest increase has been that of a higher consumption of omega-6 or linoleic acid. That is, because the consumption of vegetable oils or seed oils that are rich in linoleic acid has increased so much over the past decades, we have started consuming unnatural amounts of linoleic acid or omega-6. So the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio has shifted significantly, and we'll get into that in a moment, but I hear this all the time that we're consuming too little omega-3 compared to omega-6. But that's not because we're not getting in enough omega-3 in general. The absolute majority of people who do not have any problems with fat absorption, etc., are getting enough omega-3s in their diet, but the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is skewed because we're consuming way too much omega-6 or linoleic acid today. And remember, linoleic acid was around 1.1% of our total daily calories in 1865. It was 2% of our total calories in 1909, but it is roughly 11% today. Now, PUFAs, especially those of omega-3 and omega-6 families, they contribute to increased membrane fluidity. That is, the membranes become more fluid when more of these fatty acids are incorporated into the membrane structure. And this can affect the function of the receptors on the membrane, ion channel activity, and the activity of membrane-bound enzymes. And increased fluidity can also influence the responsiveness of cells to external signals and the mobility of membrane proteins, meaning that this can influence how our cells respond to external signals like hormonal signals, nutrients, and other factors. Now, as the mitochondria have their own membranes, their membranes also incorporate dietary PUFAs, and this can affect the function of the mitochondria and influence processes like oxidative phosphorylation and apoptosis. The composition of mitochondrial membranes is therefore crucial for their efficiency and susceptibility to oxidative stress. And there are numerous studies that show that changes in dietary fat intake are reflected in the fatty acid composition of our cell membranes, and both clinical trials and observational studies suggest that these changes can have significant physiological and pathological impacts. But what is it about PUFAs that has this effect? So, according to the evidence in the current scientific literature, polyunsaturated fatty acids in the human body are more susceptible to peroxidation compared to other types of fatty acids. And this susceptibility is primarily due to their chemical structure, like we talked about in the beginning of this episode. Now, we remember that saturated fatty acids contain no double bonds in their carbon chains. They are fully saturated with hydrogen atoms, and monounsaturated fatty acids contain only one double bond, and polyunsaturated fatty acids, they contain more than one double bond. So these double bonds are located between the carbon atoms in the fatty acid chains and are chemically reactive. You can think of it this way. When the carbon chain contains a double bond, there's an empty seat there, while in the carbon chains of saturated fatty acids, all the seats are taken by hydrogen atoms. It is fully saturated by hydrogen atoms. So the double bonds in PUFAs make them particularly vulnerable to be attacked by reactive oxygen species, for example, such as free radicals, because there's an empty seat there. And lipid peroxidation or lipid oxidation is an oxidative chain reaction where one lipid molecule after another becomes oxidized to the maximum possible extent or to form a lipid peroxide. In other words, this is a complex chemical process that leads to oxidative degeneration of lipids, resulting in the formation of peroxide or hydroxyperoxide derivatives. And lipid peroxidation occurs when free radicals, specifically reactive oxygen species, interact with lipids within cell membranes, typically PUFAs, as they have carbon-carbon double bonds, that is, they have an empty seat. Now, it has long been known that high levels of free radicals or reactive oxygen species, or ROS, can inflict direct damage to lipids. And this is why. This peroxidation reaction leads to the formation of lipid radicals, collectively referred to as lipid peroxides or lipid oxidation products, which then react with other oxidizing agents, leading to a chain reaction. And peroxidized lipids can alter the integrity and fluidity of cell membranes, disrupting normal cellular functions, and this results in oxidative stress and cell damage. Now, in medicine, lipid peroxidation plays a role in cell damage, which has broadly been implicated in the pathogenesis of various diseases and disease states, including aging, whereas in food science, lipid peroxidation is one of many pathways to rancidity. Now, peroxidation of PUFAs can lead to the formation of various harmful compounds, like I mentioned earlier, malondialdehyde or MDA, and 4-hydroxynonenal or 4-HNE, which can further damage proteins, DNA, and other cellular structures. And like I said earlier, all of this oxidative damage contributes to aging processes and is associated with various diseases, including cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative diseases, and cancer. Now, antioxidants, such as vitamin E and C, are very important in mitigating this process, that is, stopping this process. And they do that by neutralizing free radicals and thereby halting radical chain reactions. As an example, vitamin E does this by donating a hydrogen atom to the lipid hydroperoxyl radical that gets formed in this peroxidation process, which forms a vitamin E radical, which then further reacts with another lipid hydroperoxyl radical to form non-radical products. That is, vitamin E helps protect cell membranes by scavenging lipid peroxyl radicals and thus terminating the chain reaction of lipid peroxidation. Now, even though the polyunsaturated fatty acids omega-3 and omega-6 are essential fatty acids, that is, they are critical for our health, we need to get them from diet, it is crucial to balance their intake with sufficient antioxidants. And what's also important to keep in mind is, like I said earlier, the intake of omega-6 has increased so much in the last 100 to 120 years with the introduction of vegetable oils in our diet, and the daily dose is way too high. We don't need these enormous doses of omega-6 especially. And remember, we only need about 0.5% of our daily caloric intake coming from omega-6, but the amount in the average Western diet is around 11% of daily caloric intake. Now, regarding omega-3, omega-3s are also considered essential fatty acids, and there are several different omega-3s, but the three major groups are EPA, DHA, and ALA. And ALA is the only omega-3 that the body cannot produce from other fatty acids, and it is therefore considered essential. That is, we must get it through diet. That is, our body can produce EPA and DHA from ALA, but not the other way around. So, adequate intake of omega-3s in general is 0.5 grams per day for children under the age of 1 year old. And after that, recommended intake only applies for the omega-3 fatty acid alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA, as this is the only omega-3 that is essential. That is, our body cannot produce this omega-3 by other means. So the recommended adequate intake of ALA increases with age, being about 0.7 grams per day for children 1 to 3 years old, 0.9 grams per day for children 4 to 8 years old, and then 1 to 1.2 grams per day for 9 to 13-year-olds, and the lower end being the adequate intake for girls, and the higher end being for boys. And then in teenagers from the age of 14 and then throughout adulthood, adequate intake ranges from 1.1 gram per day for women and 1.6 gram per day for men. And the adequate intake increases to 1.4 grams per day for women when they are pregnant and 1.3 grams per day during lactation. And just remember, we're talking only about the essential omega-3 alpha-linolenic acid here. So for adults, this is only 0.5 to 0.7% of daily caloric intake. And according to the evidence, most children and adults consume sufficient amounts of essential omega-3 fatty acid, ALA, or alpha-linolenic acid, about 1.59 grams per day for women and 2.06 for men. Now, omega-3s, they do play an important role in the body as components of the phospholipids in the cell membranes, where DHA is especially high in the retina, in the eye, in the brain, and in sperm, for example. And they're also used to form eicosanoids, which are signaling molecules that have wide-ranging functions in the cardiovascular system, pulmonary system, immune system, and endocrine system. Now, the eicosanoids that are made from omega-6 fatty acids are more potent mediators of inflammation, vasoconstriction, and platelet aggregation than those that are made from omega-3s. And as these fatty acids compete for the same enzymes to form eicosanoids, then if the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, or rather the other way around, if the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in our diet is high, the more eicosanoids are formed from omega-6 than they are from omega-3s. So regarding the optimal ratio between omega-6 and omega-3, and I've mentioned this before, the optimal ratio is suggested to be between 1:1 to 4:1 omega-6 to omega-3. But in the standard westernized diet, this ratio is up to 52:1 omega-6 to omega-3. And regarding DHA and EPA, there are no known cutoff concentrations of DHA and EPA that causes functional impairment that can affect visual or neural function or for immune responses. And classical essential fatty acid deficiency in healthy individuals in the developed countries is virtually non-existent, because during periods of dietary fat restriction or malabsorption accompanied by an energy deficit, the body releases essential fatty acids from its adipose tissue reserves. Okay, so now we have talked a lot about PUFAs, their chemical structure. We've talked about them in vegetable oils. We've gone over statistics, explained how PUFAs build up in our body and the mechanisms in which they cause detrimental effect. But in regards to the effect polyunsaturated fatty acids have on our energy production process at a cellular level, we will touch on a couple of topics here. And the first being the membrane pacemaker theory. Now, the membrane pacemaker theory of aging is a hypothesis that suggests the lifespan and aging rate of an organism are influenced by composition of fatty acids in its cellular membranes. And this theory was developed to kind of explain the variability in longevity and metabolic rates across different species and within species. And the theory suggests that cell membranes that are rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, are more susceptible to peroxidation because PUFAs contain more double bonds than saturated fatty acids. These double bonds are vulnerable to attack by reactive oxygen species, or ROS, leading to lipid peroxidation. And as we have learned, lipid peroxidation damages the cell membrane, affecting its integrity and functionality. And this damage can disrupt cellular processes, ultimately influencing the aging process and lifespan of the cell. So, this theory links metabolic rate with oxidative stress and aging. And organisms with higher metabolic rates generate more ROS as byproducts of aerobic metabolism. However, according to the theory, species with cell membranes that are more resistant to peroxidation, that is, those with fewer PUFAs and more saturated fatty acids in their cell membranes, should have lower levels of oxidative damage, slower aging, and longer lifespans, even if they have high metabolic rates. And comparative studies among different species often support this theory. For example, birds, they typically have higher metabolic rates than mammals, but also have longer lifespans relative to their metabolic rate. And this anomaly can be partially explained by differences in membrane composition. That is, bird membranes tend to have fewer polyunsaturated fats compared to mammals, making them less susceptible to oxidative damage despite higher metabolic rates. But some might pause here and wonder that if species with higher metabolic rates have shorter lifespan, why is it that we, people, strive for having higher metabolic rates if that might shorten our lifespan? But this is not actually the case. So within the same species, individuals with higher metabolic rates do not necessarily have shorter lifespans, even though across different species, a higher metabolic rate often correlates with a shorter lifespan. So the relationship between metabolic rate and lifespan within a species is very complex and influenced by many factors beyond simply the rate of metabolism. And a key factor is the energy production efficiency, like we talk about all the time in this podcast. That is, how efficiently individuals within the same species produce their energy. And some individuals can produce energy more efficiently, reducing the amount of damaging byproducts that are produced during cellular respiration, like reactive oxygen species, or ROS. And this means that even if two individuals have the same metabolic rate, one might experience less oxidative stress, leading to potentially longer lifespans. And this makes sense in light of everything that we've learned up until now. That is, if we have a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids integrated in our cell membranes and the membranes of our mitochondria, then our energy production process is less efficient and it produces more damaging products than if our membranes have less polyunsaturated fatty acids integrated in them. And another factor is the level of antioxidants and the efficiency of antioxidant defense mechanisms. And this can vary among individuals within species, because higher levels of antioxidants can mitigate the damage caused by reactive oxygen species, the byproducts of metabolism, which are increased with a high metabolic rate. That is, make the damage caused by ROS less severe. They neutralize the damage. And this protective mechanism can decouple the traditional association between high metabolic rate and increased oxidative damage and consequently shorter lifespan. Now, other factors that affect the relationship between metabolic rate and lifespan within a species are hormesis, that is the adaptive responses of cells to moderate stress. And in the context of metabolism, mild increases in metabolic rate can induce stress responses that improve the organism's stress resistance, repair mechanisms, and overall homeostasis, potentially leading to a longer lifespan despite a higher metabolic rate. Also, genetic variations, that is, genetic differences among individuals, can lead to variations in metabolism, in stress resistance, and repair mechanisms. Now, health and lifestyle factors have a big impact, such as diet, exercise, environmental stressors, and overall health are important, because healthier lifestyle can mitigate the negative effects of a higher metabolic rate. And then lastly, higher metabolic rates are sometimes linked to better health conditions and greater resilience, particularly in environments where higher throughput confers advantages in terms of immune function or recovery from injury. Now, just before we wrap this up, another important and interesting component in regards to the effects that polyunsaturated fatty acids have on our energy production process at the cellular level is connected with the membrane pacemaker theory. And that is in regards to temperature regulation. That is, it is suggested that the membrane composition plays a role in temperature adaptation. And this is seen, for example, in species that live in colder environments. They often have membranes with higher PUFA contents than species that live in a warmer environment. And that's in order to maintain membrane fluidity at low temperatures. Because if those membranes were consisted only of saturated fatty acids, they'd be too rigid. They need to be, the fluidity needs to be there. And the more, as we remember, PUFAs, they are fluid even at cold temperatures when we put them in the refrigerator, right? While saturated fatty acids, they are solid. And so these observations, they reflect interesting adaptations that are seen in the natural world regarding lipid metabolism in response to environmental conditions. And animals living in colder environments, they tend to have higher concentrations of polyunsaturated fatty acids or PUFAs in their cell membranes compared to those in warmer climates. And this adaptation is crucial for maintaining membrane fluidity at lower temperatures because PUFAs, with their multiple bonds, remain fluid at lower temperatures, which is essential for proper cellular function and also overall organism survival in cold environments. The cell needs to be a little bit fluid so that it can function. And this is seen also in plants. That is, plants and seeds from colder regions typically have higher PUFA content compared to those from tropical regions, which contain more saturated fats. And saturated fats, they are more stable at higher temperatures and help maintain cell integrity and function in warmer climates. And as we remember, PUFAs are more susceptible to damage from heat. Now, this distinction in fat composition is an evolutionary adaptation to temperature variations, ensuring that cellular and biochemical processes continue efficiently, irrespective of external temperatures. And in relation to this, it's very interesting to look at hibernation and metabolic adjustments. That is, animals that hibernate undergo significant physiological changes to conserve energy during periods when food is scarce and temperatures are low. And one such adaptation involves altering their fat composition, their body fat composition, towards more polyunsaturated fats. And this shift not only affects membrane fluidity to cope with the cold during the time of hibernation, but also plays a role in lowering metabolic rates during hibernation. A lower metabolic rate decreases energy expenditure, which is critical for survival over extended periods of dormancy. And how do these animals change their fat composition for the hibernating period? Yes, through their diet. This has a connection food patterns. The diet of hibernating animals often changes seasonally to include foods that are higher in PUFAs as they prepare for hibernation. And this dietary shift supports the necessary biochemical transformations in their body fat composition, aligning with the need to reduce metabolic rates and endure cold conditions without active food intake. That is, as it gets closer to hibernation, the animal's diet consists of more foods that are high in PUFAs in order to acquire a higher amount of PUFAs in their cell membrane, reducing their metabolic rate to survive a long period of time without active food intake, and for their cells to operate better during cold conditions. So, the variations in lipid compositions across different climates and during specific physiological states like hibernation underscore the complex interplay between an organism's environment, dietary intake, and metabolic strategies. And these adaptations are not just survival mechanisms, but also reflect evolutionary optimization processes that allow a wide range of organisms to thrive in diverse and changing environments. Now, just before we wrap up here, I just want to kind of summarize all of this here. So if we just summarize all of this and kind of look at this hibernation part that we were talking about just now. So like we went over in this episode, the more PUFAs you eat in your diet, the more is integrated into your fat tissue and your cellular membranes, the membranes of your cells and the membranes of your mitochondria. And the epidemiology studies, they show that in today's society we are eating a lot more PUFAs than we were used to 120 years ago and before that. And we have a lot more PUFAs integrated into our fat tissue, for example. So if we look at it like this, humans have kind of become like this hibernating version of a human. The modern westernized person has kind of become this hibernating version of the human from the 19th century, because we're eating it. We're kind of sending the signal to our body that we are preparing for hibernation, because we're eating a lot more PUFAs and we're integrating a lot more PUFAs into our fat tissue and in the cellular, the membranes of our cells and the membranes of our mitochondria. And what happens when PUFAs are integrated into the membranes of our mitochondria is that the energy production process becomes less efficient. It destroys the energy production process in the mitochondria. So the energy production process becomes less efficient. That means our body interprets that as there's low energy. It's a low energy state we're in right now. So we need to do everything we can to conserve energy. We need to turn down the basal metabolic rate, the BMR. We need to keep a smaller fire in our fireplace to not use up all the energy sources that we have too quickly. So we need to turn the basal metabolic rate down. We need to close the doors into some rooms to some specific functions like the reproductive system. We need to close the door on that because we don't have energy for that right now. We need to close the door on some higher level functions like brain functions. So we start experiencing brain fog, mood disturbances, depression and so forth. And we start, all of these low energy symptoms make us like a hibernating animal. So we're giving the signal to our body that we're kind of in a state of hibernation. We're just in a state where we are simply existing instead of a state where we are thriving. So this was kind of mind-blowing to me when I realized this, and it took me a while. It took me a long time to put the pieces of the puzzles together. And I'm not saying that I have all the pieces of the puzzles completely. It's not at all. I just want to show you at least how far I've come with a puzzle and see how I have put the pieces of the puzzle together, and then you can look at it and make up your own mind. Because like I said earlier, I'm not here to convince anyone of anything. I'm not trying to sell any dietary standpoint to anyone. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. It's just I just want to provide you with all the information that I have found in my research for the past years, and how the puzzle pieces fit together, and then you can just make up your own mind regarding what you then believe is the healthy is a healthy choice. And yeah, because this took me a really long time to figure out, and I was always, I've been trying out many different things, and for me, this puzzle that I have solved to a large degree is the one that has improved my health and is helping me on the way to my fitness goals in a way that I have never been able to do before. And I think, tried everything when it comes to diet and exercise and regimes, and yeah. So just keep that in mind throughout my podcast. I'm not trying to sell anyone anything or convince anyone of anything. I'm just here to provide you with information, and then you can think for yourself. Okay. So thank you so much for today. I hope you found this episode interesting. I hope you learned something new. And if there's something you would like to talk more about, or something you really liked, please tell me in comments wherever you are listening, or if you're watching on YouTube, please give me a like or a comment. It really helps me continue on this journey. Thank you for today. Thanks for tuning into this episode. If you're looking for more information or want to check out any studies I reference, head on to my website, babyletsmove.com. You can also join me for a workout through my app called Baby Let's Move, available in both App Store and Google Play. And don't forget to connect with me on Instagram and YouTube for even more content. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider giving it a 5-star rating or a like, and share it with a friend. It really helps me reach more amazing listeners like you. Until next time, keep moving and stay healthy.